Yeah, I can confirm. I just checked and it works.
Okay, great. Thanks for that.
All right. So I think we can get started, just mindful of the time. Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to this CERLL Research Circle. Thank you so much for being here. Just a couple notes, and then I'll pass it on to Dr. Ashley Moore for the presentation. Um, I just want to thank CERLL for creating this space, for organizing events like these where we can just come together, listen to scholars, exchange ideas. I think it's a really, really nice environment. So thank you for that. And just a couple of housekeeping rules. The format of these talks is 1 hour duration in total, where Dr. Moore will present for roughly 40 minutes, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So I just encourage all of you, if you have questions, please note them and keep them towards the end, and rest assured that there will be a session where we'll do that. And just a reminder that the session is being recorded, and it will be made available on CERLL website. So if you wish, you're welcome to turn your camera off and or anything that you need to do. And yes, the talk for today is on linguistic dissociation, what educators need to know. I for sure am super stoked and excited. And with that, I'm just going to pass it to Dr. Moore.
Thanks very much, Assad, who's put in so much work behind the scenes to organize this talk. So very appreciative of that. And to Sudashri as well for coming along today and managing stuff in the room. And to CERLL for inviting me to talk today. I saw a question pop up about the handout online. If it was only 3 pages, yes. There's an effective valence graph, which I'm going to explain later. And then just 2 pages of references. It's kind of nice, actually. I can see the comments pop up on my screen as I'm presenting. That's pretty nifty. So I'll try and keep an eye on things as well. So the topic today is, as Assad mentioned, linguistic dissociation, which is a theory, a concept that I developed through my PhD study. Today, what I'd like to do is kind of expand things out from that very specific study, which I'm going to talk about in passing, and give a more general overview about what linguistic dissociation is, and think a few steps further about what are the implications of linguistic dissociation for educators, not just language educators, but educators in general. And of course, I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land too. I'm a permanent resident of Canada, so that means I'm also a recent settler colonialist on Turtle Island. And I acknowledge that the University of Toronto occupies the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's especially relevant to this talk because linguistic dissociation, as I'll go on to talk about, is something that has been, although not using those terms, this phenomena has been something that has been documented among Indigenous communities who are under colonialism, settler colonialism, and neocolonialism. So, what is linguistic dissociation? I'm going to talk us through the definition. You can read the full account, theoretical account of linguistic dissociation in my 2023 paper if you want to know more after this. But in short, linguistic dissociation is an intersubjective process through which language users distance themselves from previously acquired linguistic resources because those resources have become entangled with and subsequently come to connote contrasubjectivity. So a pretty dense definition there, and I'm going to spend some time unpacking it. The first thing to mention is that this definition is slightly different to the 2023 paper in which I described linguistic dissociation as a psychosocial process. I prefer the term intersubjective now because I think it is a little bit more expensive and allows us to talk about linguistic dissociation as an embodied phenomenon as well, while still maintaining, of course, the social, and the psychological. And I'll focus a little bit more, especially the examples that I'm going to give today, really focus on the embodied experience of linguistic dissociation, or at least the evidence we have for that. So when I say it's an intersubjective process, I'm drawing on Claire Cramsh's theorization of intersubjectivity and subjectivity. Cramsh notes or argues that subjectivity focuses on the ways in which the self is formed through the use of language and other symbolic systems, both intrapersonally and interpersonally, as individuals participate in multiple symbolic exchanges, themselves embedded in vast webs of social and power relations. Subjectivity is conceptualized dynamically as a site of struggle and potential change. One thing that I really want to focus on here is that intersubjectivity is a relatively enduring phenomenon, right? It's built up out of small micro level interactions, but it's an enduring phenomenon that plays out across multiple embedded scales. And so we have the individual, and then we can think of the social world as this multi-scalar entity. Okay, let's unpack a bit more. So it's an intersubjective process through which language users distance themselves from previously acquired linguistic resources because they've come to connote contrasubjectivity. Contrasubjectivity is a term that I developed for linguistic dissociation, and it's building again on Cramsh's theory of intersubjectivity. And I've described it as the state in which the synchronicity between ourself, our language, our environment, and the others with whom we interact fails in some significant way. And of course, this can be at various scales, but they're always co-present, right? So for example, one of the participants in the study, the PhD study, the main source of contrasubjectivity for her was an explosive argument she had with her father that led to him cutting her off, both financially, which dramatically changed the course of her life. She was in university at the time, and also personally too. It happened maybe a decade previous to her participation in the study, and still no contact with her father since that explosive argument in Hawaii. This incident, that case, is detailed in the 2025 paper that's referenced in the handout if you want to know more about that. But at the same time, that argument was, of course, steeped in societal patriarchy. As her father exploded at Ikumi, that's the participant's pseudonym, increasive assertiveness. For some people experiencing linguistic dissociation, it's less about specific people and more about their conflict with macro-level systems and ideologies, although these two, of course, manifest in multi-scalar ways. So, somebody missed the QR code for the handouts. It pops up on another slide in a little bit. Okay, so don't worry if you didn't get the handout. It'll come on a slide in a few seconds. You're not missing much. It's just a bunch of references. So let's unpack the middle of this definition. So the language users distance themselves from those previously acquired linguistic resources because those resources have become entangled with and subsequently come to connote contrasubjectivity. The first thing that's useful there is the idea of when we think about things becoming entangled with and subsequently coming to connote a distinct kind of affective experience, psychology has the term evaluative conditioning. So it's the change in the valence of a stimulus that's due to the prior pairings of that stimulus with another stimulus. So if we think about the paintbrush here offers a neat kind of visual example where the kind of paint that it's been used with, eventually it starts to take on that color as well. And so another concept that I've borrowed from psychology is the concept of affective valence, which is the quality of being perceived as good versus bad. So, for example, and various objects, whether they're abstract or concrete, have different dynamic affective valences for us. But some of them are pretty stable, and they're also, to some extent, socially conditioned as well. So this is my example. Things that are very positively valence for me, puppies, 100%. I love dogs. I really want a dog. Hopefully, we're going to get one in the new year. If you have a dog, I will be so excited. You'll be a little bit scared that I'm going to steal your dog. They're very positively valenced for me. But of course, you might be scared of dogs personally, right? And so you might not have the same they might not obtain the same affective valence for you as they do for me. But we can see that some of these things are kind of societally patterned, right? However, on the other end of things, Brazil nuts, I'm very allergic to Brazil nuts. If I come into contact with one, I have to go to the hospital. I have anaphylactic shock. Even thinking about them, talking about them, looking at them feels very uncomfortable for me because I know what the consequences are for me. But again, you might love Brazil nuts. So to some extent, we've got this balance of objective, subjective here. Obviously, this is a very simplistic way to think about affect. And it should be and could be a lot more nuanced than this, but it gives us a broad strokes picture to start from. So I want you now, online and in the room, to just take a few seconds and think about if you were going to rewrite these slides for yourself, what would be the kind of most or a very positively, effectively valenced object for you, and what would be a very negatively, effectively valenced thing for you? Just take a moment to think. And we're going to use that because I'm going to ask you to draw L1 effective valence graphs. So those of you online, I'll just skip ahead. There's the QR code for those of you who missed it a little earlier on. So you should be able to get it there. Maybe you can draw on it with like a digital pen. Those of you in the room, you've got paper there. Of course, you could just draw this very easily on an A4 sheet of paper as well. And I want to specify here that linguistic autobiographies can be very sensitive, so I'm not going to ask you to share yours with anyone else, okay? So please feel free to sit this out if you like. You can draw an effective valence graph for another language or linguistic object or something else completely if you'd rather not draw one for your L1. So this is going to be just for you. It's completely personal. I will share mine just in the spirit of modeling what this can look like. So this is my effective valence graph for English over time. So when I was young, I loved reading. I used to read with my parents, and I'd read by myself as early and as much as possible. I really loved it. And when I went into school, that kind of capital translated really well, right? I was celebrated at school for being good at writing, good at English, good at language. That continued. I did English for my undergrad. I became an English language teacher. And it only really had any sort of trouble until I became more aware of the oppressive power of English as it circulates globally in many cases. But you can still see that for me, English has remained positively, effectively valenced really across my whole life. Yours might look very different for your L1. And so that's what I'm going to ask you to do now is just take a few minutes. Again, I'm not going to ask you to share these with anyone else. This is just for you, and feel free to sit it out. But just take a few moments to draw your L1 effective valence graph. Okay, go. I noticed someone in the comments saying that theirs would be there. Hi, come in, come in. Shiva, thanks for coming. We're just doing an activity, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. Just get seated and comfortable. You don't need to do the activity. Just get comfy. Got about 40 seconds. And of course, you can keep drawing if you haven't finished afterwards. Ten seconds. Okay, feel free to keep going if you like, but I'll move on in the interest of time. I don't know what yours looked like, but perhaps I know somebody online said that theirs looked a lot like the example, my example. However, these were some examples from my PhD study. I'm not going to go into them in detail here, but you can see that they looked very different. So all of these participants had experienced, these were Japanese, English, late plurilingual. So they grew up monolingually as Japanese as their main kind of named language in their repertoire. And they acquired English later after childhood. And yet their relationship to Japanese could look very different over time. This was a participant. The red line is Japanese. The first dotted line is English, and the second dotted line is German. Here's one. Bit of a roller coaster. So those were all examples of what these graphs might look like for somebody who had experienced linguistic dissociation. I'm going to share some more real-life examples of linguistic dissociation now, not from my research, but from the general broader literature. So those groups of people that in the 2023 article, I argue have some people within those groups have experienced linguistic dissociation. The first is indigenous people distancing from indigenous languages under various forms of colonialism. And I'm going to give an example. This is quoted in Hare and Davidson, 2016, and it's testimony from the Assembly of First Nations. Today, I understand quite a few words in my own language, but every time I try and talk it, my tongue hurts. I don't know why. I ran into another woman who went to residential school with me, and we were talking about it. She asked me if I remembered how they would stick a needle in our tongue if we got caught talking our language. Maybe that's why my tongue hurts whenever I try to talk my own language. And we can see here the embodiedness of linguistic dissociation coming through. A second example is children distancing from non-dominant home languages. And I know lots of folks here at OISE actually work actively with people whose families maybe meet this description, where the home language is non-dominant in whichever context. So this is from Hinton, who was collecting recollections from college-age students in the US about their experiences growing up. This is a boy whose family were from India, but was born and raised in the US. Not only was I obviously different in my physical appearance, but I had to deal with a separate culture as well. And my linguistic background was one of the only things I could suppress by only speaking in English. I used to get so embarrassed whenever anyone asked me what language I spoke, or for that matter, even brought up anything Indian. I mean, really embarrassed. My face would get very hot. Another group of people are oppressed people distancing from a language that's associated with their oppressors. So Evan Bal is an Odisha-based artist who switched from his L1 Russian to Ukrainian in October 2023 in the aftermath of the invasion. Today, when I hear Russian spoken, it makes me want to vomit. It's physiological. I grew up in a totally Russian-speaking environment, but since Russia considers anyone who speaks Russian to be Russian, then fuck Russia. The last example I'm going to share is indicative of trauma survivors distancing from the trauma encoding language. You'll notice that in the definition for linguistic dissociation, I don't use the word trauma because it's a somewhat loaded term, it's a medicalized term, and it didn't quite fit. I didn't want to put that label onto participants, and it didn't quite fit with some of the experiences too. So contrasubjectivity is a term that is a concept that's wider than, but obviously would include trauma as well, as it's kind of defined. It can be variously defined, of course, as well. So this example is from the American-Chilean writer and playwright, Ariel Dorfman. So he's reflecting back on writing his autobiography, which he wrote in English first. And in the autobiography, he recounts two near-death experiences, one when he was very young and one when he was older during the military coup. Both these shattering events were lived by me in Spanish. So why English? I think it may have been because it was the best way of dealing with the ordeal, using the measured framework of English words to contain the pain, to look at those circumstances in a sort of roundabout, indirect fashion. English is a sort of oblique mirror that allowed me to see the events in a different, or at least tolerable light, working through the confession, show myself, perhaps reveal myself, use the distance, and treat myself almost as a fictional object. Later on, when I was reworking the text in Spanish, I would find myself sick and trembling, faint with anxiety. I argue that in all of these cases, a particular kind of affect has adhered to those linguistic resources. And actually, I found that I couldn't find a good notion, a good concept for that affect. So I'm using the term undesire. I argue that linguistic dissociation is fueled by undesire, a form of negative affect that adheres to a once desired object that has come to connote ill-being or contrasubjectivity and compels one to distance oneself from it. In a way, it's the flip side of desire, as theorized by Suhanthi Motha and Angel Lin in CERLL in their amazing article in CERLL Quarterly from 2014. Whereas desire is perceived as a lack that we experience within established and inequitable value systems, undesire is the affect generated by something once dear to us that we have somehow learned to no longer value, and that is now a painful surplus rather than a lack. So I've unpacked that definition of linguistic dissociation and some of the theories that are kind of underpinning it as well. One of the things that I want to talk about is the role of linguocultural ideologies in the emergence of linguistic dissociation, because it takes a lot to adhere. Usually we have very varied experiences in language, right? We have positive experiences, we have negative experiences, we have neutral experiences, such that maybe the general net effect is either one that's neutral or maybe positive. It takes a lot to adhere that amount of negative affect to language such that you might want to distance yourself from it. And one of the things that not always, but often shows up in these accounts are linguocultural ideologies. This is Tommaso Milani and Holly Cashman writing here specifically about queer plurilinguals in a recent special issue of the Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. but it obviously applies to all plurilinguals. Different named languages offer plurilinguals different ideological affordances because of the indexical ties that such languages have developed to broader sets of values, cultural models, and moral words. And I'm going to argue that many of those ideologies form the logics of oppressive systems, such as white supremacy and colonialism. I'm going to demonstrate this with reference to two data extracts. These are from my dissertation, which again was with Japanese English late plurilinguals. This is one of them, Yasu. You can find this in the 2025 article. And Yasu had said that on his comfort graph, the effective valence graph, I was calling them comfort graphs at that time, that he had written that Japanese is not suited to conveying messages. And I really wanted to know more about what he meant by that. So I asked him, and he said, Japanese, it's kind of quite vague language in terms of conveying emotions or opinions. Maybe because we don't usually use our language to like have discussions. Language is more like, Japanese is more like unclear, and it's kind of like floating in a space. English is a lot more straight. As somebody who lived in Japan for 10 years, I can 100% tell you that, of course, people use Japanese to have discussions all the time. They give their opinions all the time. They have heated discussions very often. So there's the truthfulness of this belief is from a critical realist perspective, which is the philosophy of science that I work with. It is highly contentious. This is another example from, this is Chisato, another participant in the study. Chisato was talking about, while living in Vancouver, she had sort of had an awakening in terms of her sexual identity. And this she had linked to changes in the effective valence of Japanese for her on her comfort graph. I talked to my friends in Japan, and I realized that it's not just a lack of Japanese terms when we talk about sexuality. I think it's something to do with the language, similar ideas here, the vagueness. And there's a lot of like, in English, it's more concise. So very similar ideas, right? Again, and actually across that data set, which was a very big data set, really, and also not just in my study, but in many other studies around Japanese plurilingualism, scholars have noticed this kind of binary system, ideological system that emerges, right? So on the left-hand side of this slide here, we can see all of these were the way that I coded my data. So you can see the kind of focus concept, and then an example of the inductive code, that one of the inductive codes that fed into this focused concept. So we've got Japanese as domestic, homogeneous, rigid, conservative, indirect, vertical, and irrational. And with remarkable consistency, I found their mirror image in the way that they talked about English lingua cultures, right? International, heterogeneous, flexible, progressive, direct, horizontal, rational. And these inductive codes are usually very close paraphrasing or direct quotes from the data. In the 2025 paper, I argue that those beliefs are rooted in what Befu has referred to as auto-orientalism. So a psychologically masochistic process that signifies acceptance and internalization by the orientalized people of the denigrated racist definition given by the orientalizers. Another example of this from recent literature comes from Akiyama and Ortega's study, in which they looked at a US and Japanese virtual exchange students and how they co-constructed in their dialogue with each other and in interview data a binary of a progressive West that is, for the most part, extremely accepting of non-normative sexualities, and an East that is not extremely homophobic and is slowly on the path to progress, but is not there yet. Again, kind of very problematic. And one of the things that I did as a critical realist is I'm interested in the veracity of people's beliefs, right? And so when Chisato says that those terms don't exist, there's no good terms for talking about sexuality in Japanese, I can tell you again, as somebody who lived in Japan for 10 years, those terms absolutely exist. This is asexual, bisexual, hetero, flexible, demisexual. Also, I didn't really know, I certainly didn't know what demisexual meant until I looked it up after the interview. So this idea that these terms are well understood in Vancouver, for example, is also not necessarily true, right? And so there's some issues with some of the ideologies underpinning or driving or exacerbating linguistic dissociation. And linguistic undesire is often a product of misrecognition caused by systemic oppression. And we can see that with the Hinton example, right? When this is obviously this feeling, my face would get very hot. What he's experiencing here is as a racialized individual, right? A racialized child within a white dominant society. There's also examples of colonialism. This is a quote from a paper by Teresa McCarthy and her colleagues about Navajo. This is a Navajo mother reporting. He'll say, speaking about her son, why do I have to speak Navajo? It's a new world. We're more into technology. We're into the Bilaga Ana, I think, white English-speaking world. I don't have to speak my language. We want to go forward, not backwards. So this idea of the colonial project of tying indigenous ways of language and culture and being to the past. And also classism as well. This is an example from Barata where this is a teacher who made a conscious decision in this case to distance themselves from an accent that for them they felt indexed, this kind of rural, kind of yokel, kind of redneck persona or identity. Okay, we're in the last part of the talk today. So what does all this mean for educators? And it's very important too, because when we think about this, as I'll go on to argue, education emerged when I asked people, where did you learn that? Very often, education, they traced it back to being told something in a class, right? Or, as I'll show, in textbooks. So first of all, I would say that educators need to recognize that linguistic dissociation exists. For so many people, when I talk about linguistic dissociation, it's the first time that they've ever contemplated that. In fact, I've never experienced linguistic dissociation. And so it was an interesting phenomenon for me to study as kind of an outsider in that sense. Although now I think I've got it with French a little bit. French makes me extremely anxious and I tend to run away from it now because of some experiences. So maybe I have L2 dissociation, I think, and it's getting worse. But lots of people haven't experienced this. However, if you have, I've received a lot of feedback from people who, when they read about this theory, see themselves in this theorization. And so it's important for us to recognize that it exists. It should be something that we build into critical multilingual language awareness, I think. This is Gail Prasad and Marie-Paul Laurie's model from TQ, in which they place power right at the center. And when we look at this, like the affective, socio-emotional feelings associated with languages, language learning, and language users. And I'm going to go on to argue that this aspect is sometimes underplayed or underappreciated in the literature on plurilingual pedagogies. And of course, the social and cognitive, even thinking about how that goes on to affect performance as well. The second thing we need to what I would hate to happen is that folks rush out and start diagnosing people with linguistic dissociation. There's a lot of other plurilingual phenomena that can resemble linguistic dissociation. For example, on the left, we can see Grosjean's model of the complementarity principle. This is the idea that the named languages within our repertoires typically pattern themselves in distinct ways across the social domains of our life. And so each hexagon here in Grosjean's model represents a different social domain, and we can see how some languages are used. This obviously is a model, and it can be more complex than this, but most of us who are plurilingual readily experience that, right? We use certain languages for certain things. Sometimes we use all of our languages for a certain thing. But it can be very different, and it tends to be patterned over the domains in which we work and engage. It also is somewhat different. It's not the same as temporary discomfort we might feel, say, for example, using a language in a group where not everybody has that language, right? That can feel rude, for example. Or maybe when you want to distance yourself from a language precisely for that reason. You want to have a secret conversation. You want to talk shit about somebody in a language that they don't use. Maybe that also. Those are kind of more like strategic. We also see it with study abroad as well, where somebody might make a strategic decision to distance themselves from their L1 for a set period of time, right? I've had lots of students who did that. In this case, that's not linguistic dissociation because the language hasn't really come to connote contrasubjectivity, right? It's just a kind of strategic and temporary. It still remains positively valenced for the language user. The third thing educators need to know is that we need to rethink some assumptions underpinning plurilingual and trauma-informed pedagogies. And I want to just preface this by saying that I wholeheartedly support whole language approaches to education and language education. It's very important. It needs to be done. But 3 minutes to Q&A. Good. All right. I'll speed up a little bit. But we're almost there. Okay, we're good. For many of the plurilinguals I've discussed today, the idea of them rationally picking and choosing resources to meet the communicative demands of the situation does not quite ring true. However, that's still, for example, this is from a recent article on translanguaging, giving an overview of translanguaging, in which the authors write that the term translanguaging makes reference to the following 10 interconnected and mutually supporting proposals, one of which is this very kind of rationalistic account of language use, right? And I'm saying that this data certainly doesn't support this kind of account, right? And so it's more complex than that. When we look at how plurilingual pedagogies, and I'm using plurilingual pedagogies in the same after Van Viegen and Sunny Lau's account, where they're using it kind of as an unsatisfactory but useful umbrella term to collect a range of different kinds of pedagogies, including translingual pedagogies, plurilingual pedagogies, and translanguaging pedagogy. We notice here that this is all, they're written about what teachers should do, right? And we get this idea, she taps into, so the educator taps into that repertoire flexibly and actively to educate. They activate the knowledge, they draw on, they plan activities that engage students in using their languages in their repertoire. And so we have this idea here, this is a maple syrup tap, right? There's this idea that there's this, for me, it conjures up this image of the teacher kind of putting the tap in, it just all kind of flowing out naturally. I think that to some extent needs to be rethought. And here again, recently we've seen work coming out about trauma-informed language pedagogy. This is from a recent article by Dunn. in which she writes about, she's specifically focusing on trauma-informed adult ESL pedagogy in Scotland. And it's kind of assumed unproblematically that placing an emphasis on the student's first language, so working with students from refugee and asylum seeker backgrounds, can ease a sense of loss and give value to the culture that they hold dear. Obviously, the data that I've shown and shared with you means that that can't always be the case, right? It's not always the case. As an answer, this work is under review right now. We're just working on the revisions, but this is work I've developed with Ava Becker from University of Alberta. And we're trying to describe what would trauma-informed plurilingual pedagogies look like. First of all, they ask teachers to design predictable, flexible, and collaborative pedagogies. So consistently invite, but never demand learners to use their full linguistic repertoires, and be explicit about learners' right to refuse and negotiate their language. I think this is implicit in a lot of how plurilingual pedagogies are written up, but it's not necessarily explicitly stated either. And sometimes it can be ambiguous. I also see when I see teachers in training sometimes implementing some of these things, this is often not quite there, right? This right to refuse, or the acknowledgement that maybe people might not want to share some aspects of their linguistic repertoire. At the same time, I want to underline that this is in no way should what I present today, I hope, be taken as an excuse not to do these pedagogies. The transformative potential of them is very important. This is a piece reproduced with permission by Warda Farah, a researcher from the UK. She works in critical speech pathology. And this is one of the young learners. I think she was 9 years old. She writes, "My best memory of Warda is when I told her speaking Bangla can make me uncomfortable. But she told me Bangla is beautiful, important language, and I teach her some words. I want to teach Bangla to my friends." So this initial uncomfort is quite common. Discomfort is quite uncommon, especially when we bring one language from one domain of our life to another. And so it's very important that we keep trying these plurilingual pedagogies, we keep implementing them, but that we do them in maybe more sensitive ways. Another component of trauma-informed plurilingual pedagogies is that we need to empower plurilinguals to reflect on linguistic desire and undesire. So the integration of learning activities that promote learners' own development of critical multilingual awareness, and interrogate linguocultural ideologies shaping undesire. So when I spoke with Yasu, the earlier participant, about Japanese, at one point he described Japanese as kind of like a spiral. And I asked him, "Where did you learn that?" And he said, "Oh, in my writing class." That makes me think, he didn't say this, this is my inference, but this is a very famous diagram from Kaplan's model of cultural rhetoric, which Kaplan himself distanced himself from and complexified later on, but it's very enduring. And it's obviously deeply ethnocentric, right? This idea that English is straightforward, and the group of rhetoric languages that he described as Oriental in the 60s is this kind of mysterious spiral. It has really not much basis in linguistic or rhetoric fact, but it has been an enduring myth. This is an excerpt that one of my participants sent this to me because she was an English teacher, and this was from a Japanese English textbook, and the title is "No Need to Beat Around the Bush," basically, in English. And basically he says while in Japanese lots of hedging is needed, you don't need to hedge in English, which of course we know is not true, right? It's a common feature of English, especially academic English, which is what this textbook was about. The last thing we need to do is rethink trauma-informed connections. One of the common strategies suggested in, for example, like translanguaging pedagogy is to group learners according to their L1. needless to say, if we say, for example, had like Russian speaking L1 students in the room, some of them were from Ukraine, some of them were from Russia, it might not be appropriate. It may be, but it might not be appropriate to just assume that that's going to be a kind of a connection that is going to sustain that student's well-being and development at that specific point in time, right? So this is the last point I'll share today. I know I'm a little over time, but we still got lots of time for Q&A, I think. It's very important that we pathologize and challenge oppressive systems and not learners. So in the TIPS approach, we really urge educators to focus on and challenge institutional racism, ableism, and classism, not the students themselves, right? So, for example, what this might look like in the case of the student from Hinton, identifying and abolishing racist policies and institutional racism within the school, and maybe enacting anti-racism initiatives across the school and surrounding community would be one place where we could focus our efforts. The last slide is just a summary of the points that I've raised in the last part. Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions.
The last slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can read.
I'll take a sip while people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And indeed, we do have time for some questions and answers. I'm just going to write in the chat. Please feel free to use the raise hand feature in Zoom for those of us that are joining online. We may have questions from the room as well, so we'll just take turns. Or feel free to write them in the chat and I can read them out for you.
Question concerning the indigenous example that you brought up, but even the second one next to it, which I don't remember now. But do you really think that this is linguistic dissociation in the sense that you have explained? Is because to me, the way I understood is really that you really put a distance vis-a-vis that language. Kind of, you don't want to know anymore to hear anymore about that language. For the indigenous example, I see quite a lot of kind of, I wish I could, but every time I speak, my tongue hurts. And why do you define this yet, in any case, a linguistic dissociation?
It's a good question.
If there is this desire, because in my opinion, there is this desire. It's not an undesire, that one.
I think in that account, if I understood that particular account correctly, she was talking in the later stages of her life, having come back to the language. She says, I know quite a few words in my language now, but I think there was a long period before that when it was more difficult. And I think there are quite a few accounts of people actively distancing themselves, especially now with new speakerhood within Indigenous communities. There is a kind of tension sometimes because younger people in the community are interested in learning, but then the older, more proficient speakers are kind of asking them why are you interested in learning this language? I'm thinking particularly here about Madoka Hamine's work in the Ryugoku Islands of Japan. She's written about that as well, where older speakers who actually have that linguistic knowledge, but they didn't pass it down to their kids. And they're also kind of a little bit suspect about why, because for them, it's not the future, and it's one that they can't understand the investments. There's another piece by I think I'm going to get the name wrong. Tassel. It's in a book. I can forward that, but that again has that kind of account. And with the second example, which was it the Hinton one? Yeah, it was the young boy in Hinton. He definitely talks about like I really wanted to push everything away, right? It was the one thing I could control was language.
But to me, still there is a big difference between that indigenous example you brought there in the fore thing, and the other one where she says, where should I speak the indigenous language? That's the past, not the future. This I see clearly
Yeah.
as a dissociation. But the first, for me, is trauma, for sure. There is trauma, but I don't know if we can equate for that.
I mean, one of the things also is that some of this work has been going back and finding evidence for things that look a little bit like. And so I don't have the data, the same data I generated with my participants, where I was able to ask more questions about, well, what did that distancing really look like for you? And, you know, they would talk about like, oh, I would do anything to avoid the language kind of things. Yeah. So some of it is just kind of missing data and we're kind of filling in the blank. And there is an issue with me going into these accounts and saying, I think this is linguistic dissociation. Sometimes I have a much fuller account. There's an autobiographical essay written by Kamal al-Saraili, where he talks about absolutely abandoning Arabic. Yeah. And that's very clear, actually. Yeah. Hi, Ruba. Yeah.
Would you connect language dissociation with cultural dissociation?
Yes.
That, like, not just detachment from the language, but detachment from culture or cultural resentment?
Sure, for sure. I mean, in my research, one of the things, and you'll notice I didn't just talk about language ideologies, but when I asked participants everybody drew like affective valence graphs today, right? My participants did something very similar. And actually, when those accounts, it was almost impossible for them to only talk about language. They talked about language, they talked about people, culture, and place. And so actually, theoretically, it made more sense for me to talk about linguocultural complexes than language per se. And so their accounts frequently wove in and out. I do think that language becomes a kind of lightning rod for those feelings, though. And yeah. Hi.
Hi. First, I'd like to congratulate you on this concept. I mean, it's very difficult to understand that we managed to survive without this concept for as long as we have. I mean, it's like one of those things that it's something simple, and it seems now that now that you have defined this, it's so simple. It seems that it's obvious and it's always been there.
Yeah.
That's me. My question is, would you extend it to a community level? I mean, I've lived most of my life in Switzerland. I'm thinking of Switzerland and say Montreal, where you have communities and their attitude to language in what are supposedly bilingual situations.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Switzerland, on the language front end, Sprachgrenze, there are 4 or 5 towns which are officially bilingual, but in practice only a couple of them, Solothurn and Neuchâtel, are really bilingual. In, say, Fribourg, and you get the same thing in Alto Adige in Italy, where you have 2 speech communities, German and Italian. People will pretend not to understand the other language, let alone speak. You know, on one side of the street in Fribourg, there are streets where one side speaks French and the other side speaks German, and they refuse to speak the other language. Because they just reject it.
Yes.
And in the case of Fribourg, you know, it's been peaceful for over 500 years. You know, it's kind of absurd. You can understand these sort of things perhaps in Canada, where you can certainly understand it in Quebec, where the French Canadians have always been having to actively defend their language, and they still do. But you have a stubborn English-speaking minority in Montreal that's been there for like 200 or 300 years, refusing to learn French. Would you extend your concept to this sort of community then? one, because these people are also, it's not strategic distancing. It's a refusal. It's an undesire. It's an othering, you know?
Yeah. I would say, so I think about linguistic dissociation as being specifically distancing from previously acquired linguistic resources. So in this case, I think probably a different thing. There's something particular, I think, because we put so much effort into acquiring resources, linguistic resources, that to then push them away is a very distinct kind of experience. So maybe in those cases where they never had that language and they're kind of refusing. Oh, okay, they learned it.
They all know these languages.
Right.
They're living in bilingual towns.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, Montreal's different, but I mean, in the Swiss towns I was discussing,
Yeah.
they know these languages.
Same with Baltic countries, like post-Soviet Baltic countries, they would not refuse, even though they understand Russian, but they would refuse to speak it to the Russian speaker.
In those cases, yes, I think. I mean, generally, yeah, it sounds like linguistic dissociation could be an applicable concept there. Yeah. And I sometimes write about it as people or groups of people as well, for sure. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for this a new concept for us, even though it's not so new, we're just describing the
Right.
but my question is more about, like, do you see, so in your input in the pedagogical implications, do you see this concept as being maybe helpful for peace building or language conflict? Because you did mention, there may be some conflicts with, visible wars and political conflict, like Russian-Ukrainian or other conflicts that you mentioned here. And how would you consider that concept?
For peace building, I mean, it's definitely applicable. In a paper just came out in Language and Society, actually, that uses linguistic dissociation as an explanatory theory for what's happening now in Ukraine. So in that sense, but that's more about like explaining how people are distancing themselves. So not much to do with peace. I do think there can be, there's a flip concept, which is linguistic reassociation, which I haven't discussed here today, but is part of my PhD thesis, where some of those participants found ways back to Japan. Sometimes it was in a very critical way, where they were sort of almost like Barbara's kind of like third space kind of work, but sometimes in an uncritical way, where they just absolutely re-bought back into Japanese nationalism and were like, Japan's the best country in the world. I can't believe I ever left it, kind of thing. So, but I think it can happen for sure. And I think those conditions for reassociation are very interesting. It usually involves some sort of bridging opportunity where the person they can reclaim the language on their own terms, teaching it to a loved one, for example, where they have control over the language and what it comes to mean. And they can provide a commentary on things like, oh, that's not a nice way of describing something. Yeah.
I think it can be very useful for the reason that it brings more to the surface what is also part of real plurilingual pedagogy. Never claims to tap and do things, like never expects that just because you translanguage, everything will be good in the best possible ways, which you read often in the translanguaging literature, and it has been heavily criticized recently because it's like, oh, I use translanguaging, so I'm transforming the word, which is not true. The idea, on the contrary, of plurilingualism is really to do what you suggested, not to impose, but to make the space for that. And if they want to use it, they do. If they don't, you can't force them. And so if we have an extra concept that also explains why they don't want, I think the moment a person is more aware of why they don't want to use that other language, it's a step forward to understanding even their own repertoire.
Yeah.
Where maybe a language has been silenced precisely for linguistic dissociation, and they don't know why, they are not even aware that it has been silenced. So the moment you name a fact or a concept, it exists.
Yeah. And I mean, I got an email from a student in China who found that 2023 article, managed to get through it, like that kind of dense academies, and wrote me an email that was very heartfelt, saying that they had lived with this experience their whole life and they had felt isolated and like something was wrong with them. And this gave a word for it. So that's... And I don't want to mischaracterize plurilingual pedagogies, right? I think it's a matter of emphasis, and I just think it hasn't been emphasized enough. And that sometimes when people pick up these pedagogies, you see that it's demanded rather than invited kind of thing. So yeah. Hi.
Sort of really does tie in together pieces of Enrica's and Elena's in a smaller way. So I'm thinking about sort of an EAP context. Part of what I love about this is it allows educators to complexify our learners, right? And it's kind of a reminder to complexify their agentive choices and that it's dynamic, which is, again, conceptually so attractive to me as an educator. And I think at the same time, the beauty of these sort of translanguaging and plurilingual pedagogies is they're so easy to implement because it really is, you know, in many ways giving more options.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, beyond the conceptual, what are some ways that as an educator you can bring that in beyond, please use all of your languages unless you don't want to?
Yeah.
Like, how would we move past sort of just remembering that someone might not want to? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. I don't have good answer for it though. I think that's the next step in this work, really. And yeah, Ava Becker, my co-author on that, I think she's several steps ahead on this as well, because she's got some projects that are coming up where she's really working with teachers on these kind of ideas. So I think there'll be more interesting things coming out of that as well.
These quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I have found also the similar result while my participants are saying like English is the language for STEM and Bangla is not for several reasons. But I have a question regarding this activity. When I was doing the activity, I have never felt the neutral part of it.
Yeah.
It always started positive for me and become more positive or negative. So I was wondering, like, why did you choose neutral? If you can let me know, because my experience is not enough to capture this.
Yeah.
Maybe you have some theoretical, concept to back it up.
So when I didn't, participants in that study, it was very interesting actually. They started their lines from various places. Some of them theorized, because we can't remember before age 3 usually, right? That's just not how most human memory works. Memory studies tells us that. So sometimes we're inferring that early time, right? And we're trying to think. So some people were like, oh, okay, it must have always been positive for me. Some people began it from neutral. And to some extent, maybe it's arbitrary because we don't know. What is interesting is that no one, despite the fact that all of them at some point had experienced linguistic dissociation, nobody began their graphs in the negative. So it wasn't like, that was one question, and it seems kind of commonsensical after the fact, but I was kind of interested. Like, I wonder if for some of these people, it was always negatively valenced. And maybe there are people like that. Actually, I'm trying to think. I think there was one participant who was a hearing child of deaf parents, CODA, child of deaf adults, I think that is, right? His started positively, but dipped straight away because as soon as he left the house, he discovered that like his home language, which was Japanese Sign Language, was not the societal language. And so he felt very quickly different. Yeah. But yeah, to some extent, these are always, of course, representations, right? These are narratives as well. Although it's called a graph, this is one of the hardest things I have in peer review because they're like, it's not a graph, and I know it's not a graph. It's just I'm calling it a graph, but it has some relationship to reality as well, I think, in the same way as most representations do. I don't think there were any questions online.
No, we don't have anything online,
No,
but
okay.
yeah.
I think that's the end of
Okay.
the session. I don't want to keep people past the time. We're already 10 minutes, so I'm happy to stay and chat afterwards. Thank you, everyone who joined online.